moderated by Dr. Jacob Oldort.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I know it's hard to join a post-lunch panel, but rest assured, this one is a real privilege for me to introduce and help discuss here with our panel here. One theme, Rob and I were talking just before the panel, and I think there's a good kind of summary of what we've been hearing today, and that is that it's going to be a long 2 years, I think. But to pick up on a theme from this morning, there is, I think, hope, and that I think is the thread that runs throughout the panels, is that unlike in 2015 and previously, we know the policies that actually work. We know what it takes, whether it is to secure the border, whether it's to face the threat from our adversary, China, or any other issue. It is, we have those policies in place. We have those America First policies, and it's a personal privilege for me here to introduce this panel, which was so seminal and formative in crafting one of those signature policies, and that is introducing peace in the Middle East. I've been thinking about the title of this panel, Preserving Peace in the Middle East. It's an interesting verb because previously, peace, we talked about ISIS. These are topics that are rarely discussed, but we have something to preserve. We have a blueprint to preserve for peace, and that blueprint came about on September 15th, 2020 on the South Lawn of the White House with the signing of the Abraham Accords, the first agreement between Israel and its neighbors in decades, brokered by the Trump administration, and again, where each of the individuals joining me here was such a critical part in crafting. So I'd like to first thank our panelists for joining us today, and thank you all for being part of this very special day. A brief note of introduction of our panelists, beginning with Senator Lankford, who is a champion of peace in the Middle East in the Congress today. His service includes the State Foreign Operations Subcommittee, which conducts oversight of our foreign assistance programs. He is, topical here, the co-founder and co-chair of the Senate Abraham Accords Caucus, which just returned from a CODEL in January to the Accords nations, surveying the progress being made. And now even his oversight and work on the Abraham Accords includes his work on the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, which as of last month will now be doing oversight on DHS's coordination of cybersecurity across Abraham Accords nations. So Senator, thank you so much. We're so honored to have you today.
Thanks, Jake. Thank you.
Excellent. Victoria Coates, Senior Research Fellow at the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. It goes on for a while. Okay. But obviously many distinguished positions in the Trump administration, including Special Assistant to the President for Strategic Communications and Deputy National Security Advisor for National Security and North African Affairs before moving over to the Department of Energy, where she was the key advisor to Secretary Briette on national security and his representative in the region. Victoria, thank you so much for being here, for joining us. Yeah. And last but most certainly not least, my friend and colleague, Rob Greenway, the President and Executive Director of the single institution in the world charged with the mandate of preserving and building upon the Abraham Accords agreement, the institution with the same name, Abraham Accords Peace Institute. Rob continues that work with allies and partners in the region and around the world. He's also an adjunct fellow at the Hudson Institute. In the Trump administration, he's a senior director, for the Middle East, part of the small but dedicated team led by the former senior advisor to the president, Jared Kushner. He's also a combat veteran of U.S. Army Special Forces. Rob, thank you so much for being here. Thanks. Congresswoman Tenney is in the program, but unfortunately she could not be with us, but we hope to have her on a future occasion. She is also a big champion on these issues. Senator Lankford, if I may, by way of a scene setter, to describe for us perhaps the perspective from Congress. Your over a decade in Congress includes both chambers and overlaps your work with 3 different presidential administrations. Tell us a little bit first about your experience working with the Obama, if there was any, Trump and Biden administrations, and then second, how that reflected in your work with your colleagues, especially with bipartisanship.
So thanks. By the way, I had to stop and stare at my tag here where it says TH James Langford and kept staring at it, trying to figure out what the TH is for. Is that the Honorable? Can I take that back to my wife and just set this on our dinner table right there on it? Y'all, I have had the chance to be able to work with 3 administrations, and they couldn't be more different in how they're handling Middle East policy on this. Some of these things are obvious. All of you track foreign policy the same as I do on issues, but the Obama administration, especially in the way they treat Iran, and make no mistake, Iran is the big issue in the Middle East. The Middle East tries to say that Israel is the big issue. If you talk to them privately, they'll say, oh, Israel's doing great. That's not the issue. Iran is the issue that's in the Middle East. The Obama administration ignored our friends and paid all their attention trying to be able to woo the Iranians to be able to come over. The Iranian nuclear deal funneled just billions of dollars and plane loads of cash to them we're all familiar with to try to figure out how they're going to win them over. Clearly, they didn't work. We watched terrorism rise during that time period. Hezbollah was very well funded during that period. I mean, all of those things that we all saw. Trump administration took a very different turn to say we're going to isolate them. We're going to try to put very severe sanctions. I talked to the leaders in Lebanon during that time period, and they literally said to me, whatever you're doing right now, keep doing it. Because the folks in Hezbollah have less money now, and they're struggling to be able to put together weapon systems and to be able to organize. And that pressure that was happening on Iran was having a direct effect on the peace in the Middle East. Now to watch what's happening in the Biden administration. They've shifted back to trying to work on the JCPOA again. They've run that for a couple of years, and they realize they're the only person pushing it. Even the Iranians aren't pushing it. No one in the region wants them to do it. And when you talk to leaders in the region, they over and over again saying, why is the administration doing this? Because they feel like that they're pushing Iran. So 2 big issues in this well, 3. That is one big issue. 2 other big issues that are out there with the Biden administration at this time. No one in the region knows where America stands with Iran. And the clear question when I talk to leaders in the Middle East right now that they will ask me privately is, what is America's plan? Or more specifically, they would say, what is America willing to do? And they have no idea. If they don't know what America's willing to do, they're going to turn to China, they're going to turn to somebody else, they're going to try to figure out how they can just survive because there's no clear plan. The other side of this is dealing with Israel. Every president since Jimmy Carter has brought a peace plan between the Israelis and the Palestinians until this one. And the Palestinians right now, and what you're seeing in the uprising is there is no message that the Palestinian leadership can go to the Palestinian people and say, here's our next plan, here's our next idea, because literally the administration's been silent on that issue. Every single president has had a different option, but has at least presented a plan until now. So the quote-unquote foreign policy president, President Biden, has been absent on some of the most significant foreign policy issues that we have as a country and as a world. And I think it has real repercussions in the area. So they all handle the issues differently, but at least they're engaging. We seem to be passive in the process, watching things happen, rather than being the United States of America. We're the world leader, and we're going to engage.
Well, that's excellent and very harrowing, and not to put you on the spot, but your work with your colleagues as well in Congress. I know you have to go back and vote with them and work with them, but maybe in broad strokes, what does bipartisanship look like?
So there's a lot of bipartisanship around Israel, quite frankly. That has been a nonpartisan issue on the whole. That has shifted somewhat. Some of my Democratic colleagues are pushing away and being more pro-Palestinian and upset. Some of it's because they don't like Netanyahu, and there's all kinds of other issues there. Israel can't be a partisan issue, though. We've been very, very careful on this. This should not be a partisan issue. We're the United States of America. Our ally is Israel. Okay, we're not Switzerland. We're the United States. Yeah. So that's one issue on this. There's a lot of conversation about where to be able to go. In the Middle East in particular, I actually had a bill dealing with the JCPOA that I brought actually as an amendment through a process. And I had 16 or 17 of my Democrat colleagues that joined me in that. That actually led directly to the White House, then a week later backing off the JCPOA. But we're able to force the hand because on the whole, when you talk to a lot of our members on both sides of the aisle, they see what's happening in the Middle East, and they really feel like we are drifting at this point, and that's not a region we should drift in.
Absolutely. No, I think that's very heartening to hear, and I just know as a former Hill staffer how difficult it is to get bipartisanship, especially on Iran, in Congress, and so it is good to know that there are sensible people to work with on both sides. And Victoria, obviously, to borrow an expression from your different life, to paint a picture for us, bad joke, but looking at the region now, kind of shifting focus across the Atlantic, tell us a bit about, this is, I would say, probably unprecedented in how dangerous these times are. I mean, China just stepped in earlier this month, brokered a deal. We'll see if it has teeth or if it's just publicity between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They're now, brokering a deal supposedly between Russia and Ukraine. Tell us a bit about what we're looking at and where we go the next 2 years, what that would look like.
Well, thank you, Jacob, and Fred and AFPI for all of your kind hospitality, and Senator and Rob, it's always a pleasure to exchange views with you. Well, and I like to say 18 months.
Okay.
I think we're almost legitimately there, or we can stop saying 2 years and start saying 18 months. And in terms of the danger of the times, I had a wonderful opportunity last June to go to Normandy and visit the beaches. My grandfather, always gets me, came up Utah second wave, and to be able to visit with my mother and his great-grandson, with a great tribute. So when I think about how difficult these times are, and they're not pleasant, that always brings me great solace. And at the same time, I think we do see a generational change taking shape in terms of the way we are postured to approach our threats. I don't remember China being a big issue in the 2016 campaign. But boy, was it a big issue in 2020 and in the midterms. I'm from Pennsylvania. I would say that actually defined the Republican primary, was the issue of China. So we now are revisiting all of our relationships and global networks in that context. But I am not in the camp that believes we have to abandon all of those global relationships and contexts and just leap into the Pacific and ignore everything else. I do agree. Heritage's president has an op-ed in Time this week talking about how we can approach Ukraine in a way that is responsible to our obligations on the Chinese front. And I think that is the way we have to consider these things. And then, Jacob, as you were saying, this remarkable announcement of a peace deal brokered by Chairman Xi between Iran and Saudi Arabia, to me, is the mirror opposite of the Abraham Accords. Instead of an American president putting his arms around former adversaries, bringing them together in a wide-ranging agreement that's going to include, economic and people-to-people contexts as well as security contacts. That's what peace in the Middle East looks like, and we've seen it, we saw it in action. And this is China opportunistically trying to exploit a terrible conflict to expand their sphere of interest. And I think the good news is that Iranian brokered or Chinese brokered deals don't tend to be very pleasant. The Iranians don't tend to keep their obligations. So my expectations that this thing is going to have many legs are fairly low. And I think the fact that we had the Boeing deal with the Saudis announced the following week shows you they're not going too far down the road. And so that is salvageable, but it's going to take work. And it's why what's happening in the Congress right now is so critically important, both in terms of the majority in the House, but also the very, very slim minority in the Senate, and the ability of senators like Senator Lankford to keep these relationships going, to be a point of contact, someone they can talk to, who can take on board their issues. And so I think, as we see potentially Iran and China playing an increasingly aggressive role in Ukraine, it's going to be a real moment for the United States to have to decide, and in concert with our European allies, what is our role? If we have other people joining that nasty little party, is there something else we need to do? And what is Europe prepared to do to defend itself against an adversary like China coming into that sort of a conflict? So yes, I think it's going to be a very active 18 months, but so much work we can do now to prepare for hopefully good news in 2025.
Oh, it's good to have a positive spin.
I
it's,
try.
Yeah, no, and I remember just on a tangent, I mean, with Senator Hatch, we visited Normandy and, kind of wiped the sand on the Utahns that served, and so that was very moving. But I think it brings up the point that this kind of awareness of what our history is, what it is that we fight for, what we stand for. We heard in the last panel about the judicious use of American power abroad, the America First approach. Again, going back to peace deals, so-called, whether by China, well, certainly China has a different agenda, but I mean, there's a peace deal and there's a peace deal, and I think, the Abraham Accords, really, we see the fruits of that today. We've seen it in the continued prosperity and collaborations between, whether it's scientific research, whether it's tourism, whether it's commercial ventures, that continues. Rob, you recently had a great piece in Hudson outlining one element of this, and that's the trade area of opportunity that we have to build on the trade progress made through the Abraham Accords. You cite there that Israel's foreign minister mentioned that Israel's trade with the Accords nations exceeded, almost reached $3 billion just in 2022. Talk a little bit with us about the benefits that you see in this area.
Happy to do it, and thanks to AFPI, the team here, many old friends, and to you, Jacob, for hosting the panel, and to Senator Langford and Victoria. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. Let me say first that undergirding the logic behind the Accords, and in contrast to what was approached in '79 with Egypt and '94 with Jordan, was this idea that economic integration would provide a rationale for a stronger bond between our partners and allies in the region. Second, that on that basis, you would defend it logically, you would protect it because of how the importance it represented to you. And it also, at the same time, brought together, again, our partners and allies in the region, historically, and in a very vital sense. And so I think we're seeing evidence of that now. And for context, the sort of $3 billion mark here in 2022, the preceding year, is up from $500 million in 2019. And it's a good news story, but it doesn't end there, because there are essentially sort of three levels of economic potential that are worth considering. And again, mindful that the goal here is to tie our partners and allies more closely together within the region. On the first level, there's just the straight bilateral ties between the individual countries, between Israel and the Emirates, between Israel and Bahrain, and so on. And that is a significant growth in trade and in new economic activity and in job creation. It's 5 times greater if you pursue that on a multilateral basis, and so take advantage of the unique strengths and advantages of each country in a broader context. And the third is about 10 times the potential, yet up to $1 trillion of potential new economic activity and over 7 million jobs in the region by 2030, if you could integrate the rest of the region and expand the Accords, as was the original intent, and I think it remains the intent. And so if you could do this, you would have enormous economic potential, not just for the countries in question, but also to tie, again, our partners to the region more closely. And again, we looked at this as a critical region in a broader global context. So between the European and Asian markets, the Accords member countries in the Middle East, North Africa sits dead center. Almost no goods and services transfer between those two regions. No information travels between those regions except through this particular part of the world that has historically known a number of security challenges. And so you're left with, okay, mindful that this is a discussion about America First foreign policy, our perspective was, how does this serve U.S. interests? Not just aligning our partners and allies, but most importantly, you have 3 choices, right? There's a tremendous risk in the Middle East that hasn't gone away. As Senator Langford correctly pointed out, and the region knows well, Iran is the principal threat. And you're left then with sort of 3 choices. One is you could accept it, abandon the region, and allow it to fend for itself. And that is not a good policy I would advocate for. We're seeing the evidence of some of that now and the consequences of it. The second option is you could insert your own resources in order to protect and defend your interests in the region. We've tried that, and that comes at great cost. And I've spent most of my adult life as part of that. And I would say that that's probably not the preferred method, and I would say there's not broad support to sustain that. So that leaves you with the third, and in our view, the most practical solution here, and it's built on the foundation of the Abraham Accords and with our partners and allies in the region, and that is a new enduring regional security architecture with an economic logic beneath it, so that it makes sense and it doesn't require the the same amount of commitment of resources to do. So from an America First perspective, it allows us to achieve our vital national interests, to safeguard them, to preserve the viability of global markets, which we are the principal architect and the principal beneficiaries, and to do it with a far less reduction or do it with far less commitment of U.S. resources, blood and treasure. And again, the economic rationale benefits not just ourselves, but also our partners. And again, I contrast that with 79 and 94. And I don't, not as a criticism, but mindful of the fact that it costs us billions every year to sustain those two agreements. I think it was a good investment, but contrast that with the Accords, which not only did not cost us anything, we ultimately ended up profitable because it was a provision of security equipment necessary to support their decision. Again, it's a different pursuit to get to our vital national interests in the region. And the last thing I would say is, because it's not always encompassed within trade, is the energy component of this. Obviously, the region is a principal source of energy for the world and will continue to be so for some time in the future. As we see Europe struggle with replacing the loss of Russian gas after the illegal invasion of Ukraine, in our view, the Accords member countries provide the logical alternative of partners and allies providing that energy, along with the United States, to sustain our partners and allies in Europe. This gets us off a dependency on our adversaries, and it gets us back to bringing our partners and allies more closely together. Again, built on a foundation that the Accords, I think, made a significant step towards.
That's great. No, and I think it brings up a very important point about kind of how we work with our allies, and how really, ultimately it is American policy that determines, how well, these agreements can actually help us deter our adversaries and achieve the American interests, which you eloquently described. Which brings us, of course, the main obstacle to peace in the Middle East, which I'd like you described a little bit of, and that is Iran. And you had a very moving speech on the Senate floor where you kind of connected all the dots, Iran with Russia and China, and these are all mutually complementary threats to the American people. Tell us a little bit, there are a couple of parts here. I mean, first of all, there's the debate in Congress now on the AUMF, the authorization for the use of military force. There's also the protests going on in Iran currently, about which the Biden administration, I think, has said virtually nothing. There's an 11-minute...
Painfully so.
Painfully so, yeah. I think a very informative video Rob Malley gave to France 24, where he basically said, we won't budge from our Iran policy, such as it is. So tell us, what tools do we have in Congress? You have the Disrupt Act and the Stop Iran Act.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's several pieces there. Iran is definitely the destabilizer of the region. What they're doing to promote terrorism around the world, what they're doing to be able to advance weapon systems to folks. It's interesting that the quote-unquote peace deal between China, that China is brokering between Iran and Saudi Arabia, is to get Iranian weapons to stop being fired at them from Yemen. So there's this whole dynamic that's still happening there in the region that's ongoing. A couple things the administration has done. They've set aside the JCPOA nuclear deal for a season, and the reason being is a lot of us have pushed back on them pretty hard to say you cannot go negotiate with an Iranian government while the Iranian people are in the street begging for freedom. Okay, so you can't go give legitimacy to a government at the same time their people are begging to have legitimacy. What China just did with Iran and Saudi Arabia was to elevate the Iranian leadership and to diminish what was happening on the street. It is classic China. China's focused on the leaders. We're the leaders. It doesn't matter what people think on the street. We cannot follow that same model and engagement by trying to be able to negotiate out with leaders and to be able to legitimize them. We should be finding ways to practically communicate with the people on the street to say we stand with the people of Iran who just want freedom. They want the ability to be able to wear their hair how they want. Now just let that soak in for a minute, okay? I mean, it is that remarkable to be able to say they're just looking for something basic in what we take for granted. So we have a responsibility to be able to say we're the United States. We not only believe the rights that we enjoy are rights that are American rights, we believe they're rights given by God to every person. So what are we doing to be able to stand up for those rights in Iran as well? So how do you isolate the regime and elevate the people of Iran? So that should be a major part of our strategy. Unfortunately, the administration is speaking almost none to the people of Iran. I've spoken several times on the floor of the Senate talking about what's happening in Iran, talking about the protesters. It's been interesting to me, the number of messages I'm getting back saying, here's a translation of your speech that you did on the floor of the Senate in Farsi, because this is moving around in Iran right now. They're just hungry for somebody to see them at this point for who they are. So I think we should be trying to find ways to practically say, we see you. And we're continuing to be able to find ways to be able to encourage them, because if the people of Iran are able to experience the freedom that most others in the world actually enjoy, that is revolutionary in the Middle East and what happens in every other relationship. You think about how much of our strategy right now is built. The Fifth Fleet in Bahrain is there because of an Iranian threat and because all that's going on. I mean, there's billions of dollars that we're spending because of the threat of Iran and what they could do at any moment to be able to shut down commerce through, depending on who you talk to, the Arabian Gulf or the Persian Gulf. I won't even get into that. Okay, so all of that is all built around a hostile Iran. We should be engaging in that. They are the major player there.
Well, thank you for your many years of leadership on this issue, and as you said, the silence from this administration is quite deafening.
Yeah, the bills that we've got are just to advance the sanctions, to make sure they don't give up on the sanctions. Our fear is they're going to say, okay, we're going to negotiate this away with the RGC or other things, and we just have some basic bills to be able to say, no, you can't surrender these sanctions. Yeah.
Straightforward, yeah. No, and then, obviously, how we relate to our allies. I mean, that's kind of part of it. Why Saudi Arabia, one reason perhaps, that it's in the situation is because of the great treatment the Biden administration has been giving it. Another ally, important ally in this very important fight is Israel, of course. And Victoria, you wrote about Netanyahu's re-election for a fifth term, and you wrote there that there's much to celebrate about the return of this unapologetically conservative prime minister. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that's probably not the view shared by the Biden administration. But tell us about where U.S.-Israel relations are right now.
It's a very difficult time for all of our relationships across the Gulf, and not to take issue with Senator Langford, but one interesting thing about what you said about the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain and being there to ensure free commerce through the Straits of Hormuz, that's basically the Carter Doctrine from 1980, which is by far and away the smartest thing Jimmy Carter ever did, and low bar, but maybe this is a bad time to be making that kind of comment. But I think, the notion that the United States would provide security guarantees for the Gulf to make sure those flows of energy, which we then needed, would freely pass through the strait was a very important thing and the bedrock, really, of the modern U.S.-Saudi relationship. What was different during the Trump administration, and this is one of the areas where the landscape was one way under Obama, completely different under Trump, and now we're back to the future with Biden, is with the shift in our energy policy. When I went to Saudi in the fall of 20 to represent Secretary Brouillette, I wasn't there as a supplicant. I wasn't asking them to turn the taps on. I was there to say, how do we coordinate? Because we had coordinated when we took the Iranian waivers to zero very productively with them. We had worked together after the Abaqaiq attacks to make sure we didn't have crazy spikes in energy prices, and that worked, and they are totally open to it. They know there's, the company in OPEC is not particularly pleasant. And so if we are playing a responsible role, they are very, very willing to partner with us. And I think, I was there when the pariah comment was made, and you could feel it go through Riyadh like a wave. Shock. How could this be said by a major candidate? And now he's president. And these things are all interrelated. When we pulled the Patriots out of Saudi in March of 21, that's when the seeds of this Chinese deal were sowed. And when the administration wouldn't return their phone calls over that, then when the administration was going nuts over energy prices, guess what? Their phone calls weren't returned. So it's frustrating to watch the administration abdicate a huge advantage that we've achieved as a nation over the last decade. Just to wrap up with Israel, it is back to the future. It's trying to force this moral parity between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and that they are equal parties in the view of the United States government, which I mean, maybe 50 years ago, maybe, if you know, are doing your best to be generous, but it's simply not true now. You know, Israel is one of the most powerful countries on the planet, notwithstanding its size, and a huge and important partner to the United States in so many fields, and the Palestinians, or rather their leadership, have resolutely refused to take advantage of any such offer, and so that it's just simply not equivalent. And trying to insist that it is leads to this kind of broken policy. And unfortunately, I think the personal animus toward Prime Minister Netanyahu is reaching a boiling over point. You know, to have the State Department summon Ambassador Herzog, you know, to be yelled at in a very public manner is, I mean, it's just so counterproductive and unhelpful. And, you know, the issues that I mean, Israel's going through enough issues right now. They don't need tremendous pressure out of Washington, especially as, you know, some of the things you might consider missteps, like the proposed legislation to ban spreading Christianity. I mean, of course, a lot of us said, whoa, 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 that's not a good thing. And to his credit, Netanyahu came out and said, no, that's not, you know, that's not going to proceed. So, you know, they are working through this process, but it's very disappointing to see all of the progress that was made in terms of reposturing that relationship as much more a relationship of equals during the Trump administration. Again, we can get back there. But we current positions and then be ready to go in the event of a change.
Yeah, no, that's pretty well said. And I think just to pick up on one segue there, I mean, it's interesting how some things are very, very personal for this administration and others are just kind of ignored altogether. The example that comes to mind, again, going back to allies, which is so important to peace and deterring our adversaries, a question for Senator Langford. I mean, two, let's say, problematic allies, Saudi Arabia and Turkey. One, there is a very personal vendetta against, and the other, we don't really see much action. I mean, the Turks were about to purchase their second tranche of S-400 systems, and the Biden administration withheld any strong action. You've been a big champion of, obviously, strong policy in both. But tell us a bit about those two allies and our relationship.
Well, I'm not sure I should vacation in Turkey. That's probably not a good idea for me. Several years ago, when Turkey made the statement that they were going to buy the S-400, their statement was the Americans are so slow to be able to sell us our surface-to-air missile systems, to be able to protect our systems, that it does take forever. By the way, the foreign military sales, that process is very, very broken currently. So they're not wrong in that way, but their pursuit of the S-400 was, I think, a different political reason for them as well. I made it very clear in multiple statements and with multiple others to be able to say, if they get the S-400, then they need to lose the F-35. You can't have the F-35 and the S-400 sitting on the same tarmac side by side and have Russian advisors walking around the F-35. That's not tolerable. So we were very clear on that up front, repeated that numerous times on it to be able to say you cannot have both. They took delivery, so my colleagues stepped up and said, well, as long as they don't turn it on, they can still have it. And I said, if it's delivered, then there are Russian advisors that are on the ground. That's absurd to say you just can't turn it on to be able to be there. They need to lose the F-35. And so I fought tenaciously and won eventually to be able to not only have the F-35 pulled from Turkey, but also production. You may not know there are about 1,000 parts of the F-35 that were actually formerly manufactured in Turkey as a part of our alliance with NATO. They have now lost all of that manufacturing. A terribly unfortunate thing that all that manufacturing got pulled back to the United States, okay? So we're actually making that back in America now. But for Turkey, they paid a pretty high price for that decision. Now, I have to tell you, Turkey's a complicated relationship for us. Turkey, we have great participation with them in some areas of the world where we have an ongoing partnership. They filled all their billets with NATO, all of those things, and at other times we cannot figure out who they are. My public statements and private statements have been, I want my friend back. Turkey was a close ally for a long time, and we partnered together all over the world. And I can't figure out who Turkey is from day to day now and who their ally is anymore. And we didn't move in that as a country, they moved. We'll learn much about Turkey in May when they have their next presidential elections. And so it's one of those things to be able to watch what happens in the next couple of months. And then we'll see. I don't think there's any chance we can move our elections to May. You think there is?
Wouldn't that take an act of Congress?
That would take, yeah, probably more than an act of Congress for that one. But so we'll just learn a lot about Turkey in May and how they handle the elections, what actually occurs there, what Erdogan chooses to be able to do around that election, and what occurs in the days ahead. But that's a complicated relationship that we need to be able to work to win back over. They're an important relationship to us. We have an air base that's extremely important to the United States and to NATO that's there in Turkey. We want to be able to maintain that going relationship. At the same time, while Turkey is basically saying to Saudi Arabia and Egypt and everyone else, we're going to be the major player in the region, Saudi Arabia is saying, no, you're not. And so there's an interesting balance that's happening in the Middle East right now where Turkey is trying to insert itself in a lot of these conflicts and a lot of these issues, whether it be in Somalia, whether it be in all over Libya and other engagements. They're spreading out their influence in multiple places and regions. And Saudi Arabia continues to say, we're the major player and we're the major influencer. So it is a relationship to be able to watch. I am frustrated with this administration and how they choose to be able to chastise Saudi Arabia over and over again and to literally push them into the arms of China. In that region, they're still furious about American public statements in the Obama administration about our pivot to Asia, because that region feels like if you're pivoting to Asia, you're pivoting away from us. So while we were quote unquote pivoting to Asia, Asia was pivoting to the Middle East. And the major supplier of energy to China is Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Iran. And China is going to just step in as their biggest customer and have a tremendous amount of influence while we're walking away. We are energy independent, and I'm grateful for that, and that's a very good thing. The Fifth Fleet is spending a lot of their time chasing Iranian weapon systems now, stopping them from going to Yemen. But though we're working towards or achieving energy independence, that region's still extremely important, and we do it to our peril to be able to walk away and leave that influence solely with China. By the way, they send their kids to American schools in that region, not to Chinese schools. They want to be allies with us. If they are not allies with us long term, it is our own fault.
That's a great point. And yeah, it's unfortunate that in these times the bold leadership from the Biden administration manifests in changing the name of Turkey to Turkey in the press release. That's a great prioritization. No, but thank you, Senator.
Sensitive.
Exactly, sensitive, right. No, and I think your point about as we pivot to Asia, Asia pivots to the Middle East, or pivot away from the Middle East to Asia.
Right.
Asia pivots to the Middle East, should be. But that's a good segue, Rob. On the Abraham Accord, you recently wrote in the Jerusalem Post about the Abraham Accords as a kind of deterrent against China in the Middle East. Kind of reflecting a little bit on the trade piece, but then more broadly as well. I mean, China's investments, I mean, you look at UAE, they have, I think, 2 port projects there. Obviously, the port in Haifa, which the Trump administration worked very hard to counsel away from. But talk to us about today, the Abraham Accords as a unique vehicle to deter China.
Yeah, and it's more of a positive alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. So if you think about it, right, their principal objective outside their own borders is to obtain those resources that are required that they can't provide for themselves. In the Middle East is chief among them, and it's not my assessment, it's their own judgment. So about 10 years ago, they wrote very clearly they have one preeminent goal relative to the Middle East, and that's uninterrupted supply of energy, for which there is no replacement. And so for them, it is a critical requirement. It is also a critical vulnerability. And as Senator Langford pointed out, more than half of that is coming from our partners and allies, our traditional partners and allies in the region. It's now somewhere close to 45% of China's oil, and they're also the 3rd largest natural gas importer. That isn't going to change, and they're making no efforts to alter that. In fact, it's increasing. And so from a strategic perspective, the Middle East is critically important to China and irreplaceable to China because they can't sustain economic growth, let alone grow, and there's no military that runs on renewables. So it is oil and gas, it is really oil alone that constitutes the basis of China's military threat. So from two strategic perspectives, it is absolutely vital to China, and we're seeing them act in accordance with their interests. And they're taking advantage of our neglect because, as Victoria pointed out and as Senator Lankford mentioned, this is an area where we have the traditional advantage. I would say that for our perspective, the Abraham Accords is a constellation of U.S. partners and allies bound together by shared mutual interests. And that, I think, constitutes a positive alternative. And I think we're always looking for a positive alternative to what our adversaries are doing. And so it makes logical sense that reinforcing this policy would return dividends. And again, it's interesting to see what we have forgotten. And I'm reminded that in the Second World War, we originally started to pursue as a matter of strategic priority, destroying the infrastructure in Europe that the Germans were using to project power, their railways, their road intersections, their bridges, et cetera. We realized that it wasn't a good policy, it wasn't terribly effective. We would need that after successfully concluding a conflict, so we decided that wasn't the right thing to do. The second alternative was go after manufacturing capacity, industrial capacity, determining that if they couldn't produce tanks, we wouldn't have to fight them. The reality was that was counterproductive. It was ineffective because there were enormous civilian casualties associated with it, and we would need that infrastructure after the war as well. Finally, after about 4 years, we came to the right conclusion and realized that energy was the strategic priority. Germany didn't have it. They had to go get it. And if you could prevent it, it didn't matter how many tanks and planes you had. It was completely irrelevant. And now I would say the same is true in theory and in principle with China. If you can hold their principal dependency on oil and gas at risk, you could prevent all kinds of bad outcomes. And if, in the event that you had to, it rose to conflict, you would have the decisive and strategic advantage. And I would add that we took Iran and Venezuela off the global oil markets, and we managed to keep things at a manageable pace, and an interesting contrast, because the ultimate arbiter of any policy is its results. At the same time we were negotiating the accords, and while Victoria was in Riyadh, we managed to get OPEC Plus to get to a much more favorable outcome by a 9 million barrel per day cut. Contrast that with last year's request to get 100,000 barrel a day increase, which they didn't get. That's an interesting contrast in what effective policy yields and where that benefits everyone in the United States, and I'd say also our colleagues and counterparts in Europe and in Asia. So in our minds, the Abraham Accords and our partners and allies are a bulwark against Russian aggression, against Chinese predatory practices. But strategically, this is of critical importance to them, and it ought to be to us. And if we ignore it, we're ceding a critical vulnerability and requirement to our adversary, and one which is going to present an economic boon for China, and it's going to be potentially catastrophic for us. And the odd thing is, our partners in the region absolutely want none of this. They understand China as a customer long-term. They appreciate the fact that they purchase, but they don't want a partnership with them for all kinds of logical reasons. They desperately want this partnership again and have always wanted it with the United States. So it is ours to lose. So in a sense, it's a vacuum, and it's a result of us sort of abandoning the region to a certain extent. And certainly that's the perception. But more to the point is we are actively pushing our partners and allies in the opposite direction. It is a strategic choice. And they regret it, and frankly, we're going to bear unfortunate consequences as a result of it.
Well, it's a very grim picture, but of course, the solutions are pretty obvious, and which all of you kind of laid out in different respects. But I wonder if, and this is not a very difficult question, I've probably been thinking about it a lot, but top threat and maybe top missed opportunity today in the Middle East. See it. Whoever wants to start first.
Ladies first, always.
We could go by height.
Yeah.
I'm trying to be creative with the threat because Iran obviously is the key problem, and it's the regime in Iran. And to what Senator Lankford was saying, it's why this is such a shameful situation we find ourselves in now, that we can't summon the will to speak out in support. I, of course, am a member of a 501c3, so I would never, ever look at polling. But if I did, I might have seen some polling that was taken both in June and October gauging, and I published this, so it's not a secret, attitudes of Americans towards the Iranian people. And the July polling came back with Democrats very much in favor of the JCPOA reentry. Republican numbers stayed more or less consistent between the two. The big shift in October was Democrats, a majority of Democrats said they wanted to prioritize human rights over the JCPOA. So there is broad support for this among the American people, and it's international. When I was in Rome in November, the same Roman government that had put boxes around the ancient statues in the Capitoline Museum when Rouhani came to visit had a big banner across that same Capitoline Museum saying, "We stand with the women of Iran for freedom and life." So the opinions are shifting, and that is maybe a great opportunity that's being missed. So I might say this problem set is one and the same. The big problem is Iran, and the big missed opportunity is the potential to get that regime out would be best, but into some sort of different state, absent a major conflict. And I had the somewhat sober duty last week of having to argue against democracy promotion as a reason to go to war, which is hard for me since I wrote a book about the history of democracy. But it occurred to me that the rhetoric we're hearing out of the administration on Ukraine it could be plucked right out of George W. Bush's second inaugural. And the problem there is that then you're going to war for an abstract. And democracy has to be the choice of the people who are going to participate in it. And so if the Iranian people, make that decision, there's much we can and should do to support them. My concern is that if you cast Ukraine as a struggle for global freedom, you lose your vital national security interests. And so I would want to avoid doing that with Iran while being extremely eager for a change of management there.
Very good.
Yeah, change of management's a great idea. They're on it, and the Iranian people. So I would say areas where we can have greatest gain, definitely supporting the people of Iran, speaking out there, because we're back to winning hearts and minds. The more that the Iranian people hear us say, we are not your enemy. The freedoms that we have, we long for you to be able to have as well, because the vast majority of the Iranian people, that's what they're looking for, is just freedom. So the more that we can do that, we have opportunities to be able to make gains there. The second thing would be, I mentioned off the cuff a while ago, and that's our foreign military sales. Right now, if you're a country in that region and you want to buy American weapon systems that they know are the best in the world, you can contact our government. You can wait in line about 7 or 8 years and we'll consider it. Or you can call China and they'll deliver something next week. Okay, it's just that straightforward. And so we're teaching every government we're not reliable. Yes, we have the good stuff, but we won't send it to you until we think about it for a while. And so they know the Chinese equipment's not as good. They've clearly learned the Russian equipment is not as good. There's been a very public display of that. But they want to get ours, but if they can't get it, they've got to get something. And so they're going to align with the Chinese. So a gain area would be to actually clean up our foreign military sales, and so we can actually engage on that. As far as a threat to us that I think people are watching, definitely Iran, as I've mentioned before. The other one's Chinese telecom. They continue to advance security systems and security apparatus to every one of these governments. You can go to several countries in the Middle East now. They've got a camera in every corner, just like they do in Beijing. And it's Chinese equipment that the Chinese have provided to them and have taught those governments, here's how to monitor your own people. And they're using that, but they're not only monitoring their own people, the Chinese are then using that same system to also monitor their people as well. And then we want to be able to partner with different governments, and if we want to be able to partner in technology and communication or share intelligence, whatever it may be, and it's running on a Chinese backbone in telecom, you can't trust it. So our big threat is that the Chinese are engaged so much in their telecommunications and in their backbone of their networks that when we want to partner with them, we no longer can really have a free exchange of ideas and engagement, because the Chinese are tracking us in every corner as we move, and everything that we share with them on intelligence information, the Chinese are getting as well. So we pull back and say, we can't share. We want to, but we can't because you're in this, and they're so far down the road that they can't just rip and replace it, and we're stuck. That's a very real long-term threat. Fortunately, the Chinese know that extremely well, and so they're pushing into it. Every negotiation with every country that they have is, we will do just about anything for you if you'll install our backbone of our telecom. If you'll do that first, we'll give you any discount on anything we want to have, because they know what happens from there.
And I have to say, my boss just walked in.
Should we all stand?
Yeah, I think so. Perhaps a round of applause.
Rob?
Hard to improve on either, and would endorse both comments. I would add this, that Iran certainly is the principal threat to the region's stability and security. I would say and it's worth doing from time to time, is just envisioning a region with Iran in possession of a nuclear weapon. And as someone that's watched this for decades, they're not just as close as they've ever been, but the perception of the region, and I think there's an argument for it, is that we are fundamentally allowing it, and in many ways we are paying for them to do it. That's the perception of our partners and allies in the region, and I suspect that's probably the perspective in Tehran, a circumstance that I think they'd never thought that they would enjoy. And there are also now some doubt in their minds as to which and when and under what circumstances and to what effect Israel would respond, and to the degree to which the U.S. would support our allies in Israel. And so I think that presents an enormously dangerous context, because if you can imagine what would happen to global markets if Iran was in control of them, because that's exactly what this means, all east-west trade between Europe and Asia, 20% of the world's trade, 30% of the containerized traffic, and 40% of the world's oil and gas under Iran's direct control. And you don't have to guess what that would mean, because you can see what they're doing now without that control, and it's certainly not to our advantage. In the longer term, the greater global strategic risk is China, and again, this is ground that we don't need to cede to them and should not cede to them, and so our interests are served by the biggest opportunity in both cases, and that is our partners and allies in the region who desperately want a stronger relationship, and the Abraham Accords is a foundation, a part of that. And I think if we're to pursue that, I think we'll be able to address both in a meaningful and effective way.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I think we're about to wrap up here, but if I could just kind of close on a personal note and say, first off, my parents both immigrated to this country, so their hearts and minds were won over. And so, Senator Langford, thank you so much for your eloquence and your hard work, leadership on behalf of the American people, which, as you described, is such a beacon of hope to free-loving people around the world. It's not just ours, but it's ours to share and to demonstrate. And somebody who's developed a career over the last 2 decades on the Middle East in the shadow of 9/11 as a New Yorker, it is also inspiring to hear from you all about a real vision for peace with a real plan of solutions, and that is, of course, in America first, foreign policy and national security policy. So I do want to, in the time remaining, just thank you all for your leadership, for your vision here, and for spending time with us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Make sure.
It's a very important day for the world. It's a very important day for peace.
Mr. President, you have successfully brokered The historic peace that we are signing today that has broad support in Israel, in America, in the Middle East, indeed in the entire world.
The historic agreement you all broached, none of us, frankly, would have thought possible.
There is truly no one, I believe, without the genius and the leadership that could have done more alongside our former president than Jared Kushner.
The Abraham Accords, I think, has done amazing things from a national security point of view for America, for the world. But what I get the most satisfaction out of is seeing people from Israel, from the Arab world, come together, meet each other, have dinner together, do business together.
Today the world sees that they're choosing cooperation over conflict.
And I think that what it's doing is it's lowering that hostility, which has really existed now for over 70 years in the region, which is leading to the restoration of Jews and Muslims and Christians all being able to live in harmony in that region, which is something that I think is very, very positive for the world.
We have shown today that such a path is possible.
The President of the United States asked me to do a job, and in doing it, you just have to figure out how to do it the best you can.
Arabs and Israelis, Muslims, Jews and Christians can live together, pray together, and dream together.
What was achieved in the last administration was not the end, but truly the beginning. What a difference 1 year makes. 1 year ago, the other side was riding high and flush with victory. The Biden administration was declaring a quick end to the pandemic. The media elites were predicting a new era.
The end of this Trump era.
The Silicon Valley was sure that big tech would reign unchallenged. The Washington elites were confident that the America First movement was done. It was over and it was finished. Of course, 1 year ago, the America First Policy Institute did not exist. The team which fostered a renaissance in American prosperity, managed a resurgence of peace abroad, and expanded the American dream came to a realization: our job is unfinished.
Nothing worth doing ever came easy.
With America still in need and with a dangerous world at our doorstep, we had a duty to come together and to continue the fight. 1 year ago, that group of American patriots came together to deliver a promise to the American people, a promise to put America first always. And on April 13th, 2021, the America First Policy Institute was born.
Former Trump administration officials are launching the America First Policy Institute.
Our mission started not a moment too soon. In just over a year, the left has traded peace and prosperity for defeat and destruction. In just over a year, from defeat in Afghanistan and the war in Europe, to a blundered pandemic response and historic inflation, to big tech censorship and collusion, even something as sacred as parental choice has been put in jeopardy by the radical left. But there is good news. AFPI is not waiting for the left to leave. We're not waiting for the end of their term. We are fighting back now. We are delivering on our promise to fill the leadership void left by the Biden administration, the promise to put America first always. The America First movement needed a permanent home, and 1 year ago, it got one, right here at the America First Policy Institute. We built the largest conservative coalition on record with the Save America Coalition and beat back the big government socialism bill pushed by the Biden administration and the radical left in Congress. We brought together 373 economists to underscore the threat posed by the Biden administration's reckless spending programs. AFPI nurtured the movement to empower parents by fighting for school choice and launching a school board effort on patriotic education to drive transparency and accountability. Through our constitutional litigation partnership, we advanced a groundbreaking big tech case collecting over 100,000 tech censorship stories from across this great nation. We fought the Biden vaccine mandates all the way to the Supreme Court and won. Now we are fighting the Biden administration again by filing the largest religious liberty vaccine case in the country. We are fighting on behalf of Air Force members facing discharge from the military because they won't get the vaccine. Holding the line against the radical left's freedom to cheat voting bill and website-led efforts in 15 states to make it easy to vote, but impossible to cheat. Hardly a day goes by without an AFPI leader being seen on national television or being quoted in the news. In fact, we secured nearly 1,500 mentions in the media in just our first year. There's a lot of work supporting America First policies and building our brand.
AFPI, you guys rock.
Our efforts did not stop there. Last fall, we launched our sister C4 organization, America First Works, to advance policy at all levels of government and engage the American people in their government. The best part? We're only just beginning. This year, we will advance policies that serve families and all Americans, not the elites and government bureaucrats. We will firmly cement ourselves as the home of the America First movement and work at every level of government to make sure that we put American jobs, American freedom, and American security first. We know these policies already work because we've done them once before. Let's return the greatest economy in the world and make the Trump tax cuts permanent. Let's make America energy independent again and lower energy costs and improve energy reliability for all hardworking Americans. Let's improve our health outcomes, offering more choice and lowering costs in our broken healthcare system. Let's finish the wall and secure the homeland. Let's advance real school choice and really empower our parents and our students and ensure that those same students know the true American story. Let's fund our police and return law and orders to our cities. Let's make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. Let's defend our American values like religious freedom and the Second Amendment. Let's drain the swamp and hold the administrative state accountable. And let's remember the time-honored policy of peace
requires strength.
Join our mission today. Help us grow this movement. We will put America first, always.
It's going to be only America first. America first.
America's future is America first.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start our last panel, Russia and the War in Ukraine, moderated by General Keith Kellogg.
Well, thank you all for joining us for today's discussion, the last panel of the day. And we want to thank the panelists for leading us in this conversation today. I think most of you understand that Ukraine's been in the headlines the last few days, something going on there. And you're looking at a war that's the largest war in Europe since World War II, between the two largest land masses in Europe, Ukraine and Russia. The problem we have is that it's a little bit muddled over there on what's actually happening and what's happening here. And I believe this is because mainly the administration has not clarified to the American people what's at stake at this war and what the end state should be as well. And we just entered the second year with no end in sight, and I think Americans are rightly concerned about the direction this administration is taking. I recently made a 2-week trip to Ukraine, supported by the Weatherman Foundation, where I visited not only Kyiv and Odessa, but the very areas that have experienced flashpoints in the war, including Izium, Kharkiv, and Donetsk. And the reason why that's important, because when the government officials travel to Ukraine, the furthest they get to is Kyiv, and then they take them into Bucha, which is actually a suburb of Kyiv, where some of the atrocities took place. And my position has been from day one that it is in America's interest that this war end as soon as it can. And by doing so, if we can move a strategic adversary, that's not a bad idea. But primarily because it'll finally allow us, after over 21 years, to finally pivot to China, which is the emergent and greatest threat we face in the United States today. And for over 21 years, we've been unable to do that because what happened in the Middle East, in which actually was a periphery fight, not a major war, and then we focused in on Europe instead of in the East. And I also think it's unacceptable for the United States to be carrying the majority of the share of the burden for it as well in the American taxpayers. And that's what we've been doing today. Europe clearly needs to do more. And America's focus right now should be pushing NATO and our European allies to contribute more military assistance to Ukraine. For example, Turkey, home to NATO's second largest military, has contributed minimally, while Japan in the Pacific is among the top 10 donors. I think this is kind of unbalanced. My other concern in this war is that the Biden administration has not yet established its end state in Ukraine. We have seen no meaningful progress or directed efforts from the Biden administration to bring both Russia and Ukraine to the table, nor have we received that defined end state that we should be getting. It's a line of supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, as much as it takes. I've said repeatedly, that's a bumper strategy. That's a bumper sticker, it's not a strategy. And this lack of clarity and piecemeal approach from the Biden administration raises very real concerns for the American people. They talk about the border and they talk about Ukraine. The fact is a superpower should be able to do multiple things at the same time, not just one at a time. Joining me today is Editor-in-Chief of the Federalist and Fox News contributed, Molly Hemingway. And Molly has been a prominent voice in the media on this topic. And we're excited that you could join us, Molly. We are also honored to have James Carafano, who serves as the Vice President of Heritage's Foundation Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy. James also has served in the Armed Forces for over 25 years, retired colonel, and a former paratrooper. That's a big point. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce my colleague here at the America First Policy Institute, Secretary Robert Wilkie. Robert served as a Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs during the Trump administration and was also the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel at the Department of Defense. So thank you all for being here, and we'll get right into it right now. Molly, I want like the first question to you, if you may. In an interview on Fox News recently, you stated that President Biden's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been confusing and all over the place. One of the challenges I have had with the administration's response to the war is its incremental armament of Ukraine by giving them only piecemeal weapons whenever they so decide. This approach arguably has led to the prolonged conflict by impeding Ukraine's ability to reach a decisive victory. Do you share that view, and what should the Biden administration be doing differently?
Is that all? Yeah. Well, I do think that the Biden administration has had a very confused approach, and they have not articulated well what their strategy is for this conflict. But I actually think it goes back quite some time. I mean, if you take it all the way back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the George H.W. Bush administration actually managed that incredibly well. It was a very difficult and fraught moment in history, and there were a lot of nukes flying around, nukes everywhere, and everyone did a really wise. They were wise in how they handled nearly all of that, with the notable exception being that they knew even then that Ukraine would be a problem. And a lot of the people at that time advised Ukraine to understand the reality that they share a big border with Russia, that they should just have that be part of their understanding, their conception of themselves. But a lot of U.S. people for decades kind of pushed Ukraine and saw it as a way to go after Russia. And even with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there are a lot of people who are very wary of Russia for understandable reasons. So Russia, I think it's good to kind of have an understanding, what is their thinking here? They are believing that there are certain areas in Ukraine that are really Russian dominated. In some cases, that's more true than others. Crimea, definitely true. Donbass, less so, but still a big issue. It's been a big domestic problem for Ukraine that they have people within their borders who are voting for Russian-friendly governments. So Russia has this interest there, and they also have this interest in securing access to the Black Sea. And so these are things that are going to be there regardless of what happens with the current situation in Ukraine. They also have a method of fighting that is unbelievable. I mean, you go back to World War II, which is the war everybody likes to talk about, and just how many bodies the Russians were willing to throw at a problem, and how they have such low regard for the lives of the people that they conscript into their war efforts, and how they're willing to lose millions or tens of millions of lives for their aims. And so that affects what we're willing to do. Like, if we're going to actually take that on, are we really going to put up millions of bodies and the type of efforts that would be necessary for a decisive end, keeping in mind that this is a country that has 6,500 nuclear warheads? And if we don't, then we should be working and we should have been working toward the best possible negotiated settlement for Ukraine, given this reality. And so I do think it's confused, but I think everyone seems sort of confused about it and is not dealing with the reality of the seriousness of the situation.
And Molly brings up a good point when you look at the numbers that are out there, when you look at the casualties. Right now, when we were over there recently, the Ukrainians were very open with us, and they said they have lost 100,000 soldiers in a year of fighting, dead. And generally, when you look in the military, you look at dead to wounded, and it's about a 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 ratio. So you're talking about 300,000 to 350,000 dead and wounded. The Russians' number is much larger. They believe that over 150,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. That means you're looking at 300,000 potentially dead and wounded. Comparison. In the Vietnam War, 10-year war, we lost 50,000. Korea, we lost 40,000. So that means the Ukrainians alone have lost more in 1 year than we lost in 2 major wars we were fighting. And it's something to be, it's really, when you look at the fighting of the Ukrainians, what they're doing, they're not really able to get into an attrition fight, even though you look at what's seen right now, that's actually happening to them. One of the other things they talk about is nuclear weapons, and there's always a concern when you hear about escalation. What's the next step on escalation? What is Putin going to do? What are his generals going to do? And in their philosophy of fighting, they in fact do talk about the use of what they call tactical nuclear weapons. I grew up in an environment where we never wanted to say anything that anything's a tactical nuclear weapon. A nuke is a nuke is a nuke, and we wanted to go that way. But it's in their doctrine. And a tactical nuclear weapon is a sub-kiloton weapon. It's something that kills blocks, not cities. But if you cross that nuclear threshold, the whole world changes. The only country that ever has used an atomic or nuclear weapon is the United States of America. So you have to be concerned about it because it's in their doctrine, and they do think about it. And one of the individuals that has written about that, is in fact the last commander they've got currently. When I say last, he's the fifth one they've got in there, is Gerasimov, who's currently leading the fight in there. So this is to James. James, you recently published a piece regarding the risk of nuclear warfare in this war, in which you argued that the U.S. and our NATO allies should not cave to, quote, nuclear blackmail, meaning they should not be deterred from arming Ukraine for fear that Russia will respond with a nuclear attack. Do you view Russia deploying a nuclear weapon in Ukraine as a present and a credible threat? And what, if any, circumstances would lead Russia to deploy one?
Yeah. So I have to correct you. So I wasn't in the Army over 25 years. I was in the Army exactly 25 years. But why that's relevant is I actually spent a lot of my career in the Army dealing in nuclear weapons, because during the Cold War, the U.S. Army actually had the largest inventory of tactical nuclear weapons. And of course, we war planned against the Soviets all the time. So this isn't something that I came to yesterday in terms of thinking about this. So I think there's a couple of things to put on the table. And the first one, the most important one, is the enemy gets a vote. So anybody here who sits here and tells you exactly what Vladimir Putin is going to do is just making this stuff up, because only Vladimir Putin knows what Vladimir Putin is going to do. I was in the camp that says the Russians will never do a winter campaign, because if they did, they would plow through an enormous amount of men and material, accomplish nothing, and be much more vulnerable to a Ukrainian counterattack. And what did Vladimir Putin do? He did a campaign anyway, so obviously he's not listening to me. So having said that, there are a couple of problems. This is, we think, talk about the escalatory ladder, which is a conventional response, and then maybe a tactical nuclear response, and leading up to strategic, with the idea that at some point the problem of the war becomes so painful that you think the other guy will stop and want to get off the ladder and make a deal or back down. Here's the challenges for the Russians. Conventionally, they can't defeat Ukraine. I mean, that's demonstrably proven. So they've actually lapsed into what's called a strategy of exhaustion, which many people will tell you is absolutely the most inefficient military strategy any human being could possibly think of. And in almost any war you can think of, the strategy exhaustion actually exhausted one or both sides. So it is literally the strategy of last resort of the stupid. They can't defeat Ukraine. So the notion is, oh, I have a brilliant idea. Let's start attacking other countries. That, to me, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I think, putting a nuclear weapon against NATO, I think, obviously, jumps up several points in the ladder really quickly. And having been demonstrated after a year of warfare that they really aren't willing to risk going on NATO territory to fight, even though they know that NATO support is really what's really causes really embarrassment of a military situation for them. Would they really risk, attacking NATO with a nuclear weapon? I think that's the least likely scenario. So what's plausible? Well, they could detonate a nuclear weapon inside Ukraine. Ukraine's a combatant. They're a combatant. You can use nuclear weapons against your combatant. There's nothing wrong with that. And as the general said, it's in their doctrine. But the key thing about their doctrine is that it's been in their doctrine virtually forever, since they've had tactical nuclear weapons. The thing about their doctrine is they've never exercised their doctrine. And I can tell you, we had tactical nuclear doctrine as well. And we never exercised it either. And I can also, well, I'm probably not supposed to tell you, but if you actually looked at our nuclear war plans, they didn't actually conform to our nuclear doctrine. So the notion that because it's in their doctrine, they're more likely to do this, history doesn't bear that out. And then I'll just very quickly get to the practicality of using tactical nuclear weapons, in which I know a lot about, because I try to figure out how to do that and quickly discover it's not terribly practical. A nuclear weapon is just a big bomb. And the most likely thing is a low altitude yield, which gives you the maximum explosive power. It's still a big bomb. There are actually conventional weapons out there that can create bigger bombs than that. If you think about nuclear radiation, most of the radiation actually that's really lethal and deadly in the near term is within the confines of the explosion. So people are much more likely to be burned up by the fireball than they are nuclear radiation. Outside of that, you're in low dose radiation, which nobody really knows really how much of a health hazard that really is. Every bomb, every weapon in military history is designed for fire and maneuver. I shoot at you look like a very nice person, but I attack you, right? Not because I want to kill you in particular, but because putting fire on you is going to help me, assist me get to my objective. I'll go around or suppress you or something else. So it works the same way with attacking a nuclear weapon. You do the nuclear weapon and then you maneuver. And this again gets back to the Russian problem. They don't really have forces that are trained to operate in this environment. It's very doubtful that they have the logistics so they could drop a bomb. Would it scare the Ukrainians into quitting? I doubt it. There's 44 million Ukrainians who have been fighting for a year. And we've seen what happens is when you raise the level of violence against your opponent doesn't get more timid. They actually get more aggressive. So there's just a lot of practical problems with thinking of nuclear weapon as an option. And the other thing is he's cried wolf about a gazillion times. I mean, he's continually raised the nuclear specter, and nothing has ever come of it. No signs on the ground, no signs of it, not even any signs of any kind of follow-up. It's just been that. So in this particular thing, look, I'm not saying Putin's not going to escalate, because Putin's done a lot of stupid things, but do we have any practical evidence that he would escalate to a significant way that would grow the war beyond its current bounds? We just haven't seen that.
Yeah, and when it goes back in historically, we used to, as in the American Army, we used to have the ability to use a tactical nuclear weapon. One was the Davy Crockett, which we got rid of because we didn't think it was a good idea for a sergeant to start World War III.
Or have a weapon that had a bigger explosion radius than the range of the weapon. That was not good either.
Which leads me to the second part. We also, years ago when I was in Special Forces, we actually carried what's called a SADM, S-A-D-M, Special Atomic Demolition Munitions. And I was on a team that carried one, and I kept thinking to myself, if this isn't a one-way mission, I've never seen one before. As you said, the blasting radius was bigger than our ability to escape out here. And the last one was, if he does use it, there was always a talk, well, how would we respond? And do we have an ability with small kiloton nuclear weapons? We do, but they're located on our ballistic missile submarines. So you can imagine if you send one off the rails to respond, and it comes off a ballistic missile submarine, and you're sitting in Moscow, and you're seeing a missile come out of the water, what are you going to do? You're probably going to respond pretty large, and then it's probably not a good idea. So hopefully everybody's got, a belief that it's not going to happen. But I will tell you from the discussions with Ukrainians when we were there, they fully expected that this may happen, that it's in their ability to do it, and they're prepared for it as well. Go forward. Robert, a question for you, sir. The Biden administration, and this is one will be interesting, I'd like to have everybody answer this one as well. The Biden administration has offered vague and abstract answers to the question of what is the American interest in Ukraine? The Biden administration has stated that the American interest is defending democracy abroad for as long as it takes. That's their policy. And this answer is far from a clear national interest of the United States of America, and even further away from the America First position, which defines national interest by principled realism in terms. Can you define for us specifically what you believe our national interest is in this war? And I'd like the others to answer as well.
Yeah, I'm a bit of an outsider on this, at least in terms of the public discourse, because I think the one word that is operative when we look at this conflict is China. And let's take a step back here. I said earlier today that Golda Meir proclaimed that if someone continues to tell you that he wants to kill you, believe him. And the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians have declared to the world that not only do they want to end the rules-based American-centric world order, they want to destroy the United States of America. Putin is Xi's vassal. What's interesting here is the petard that Xi has hoisted himself on, because he has declared this limitless partnership, and he's in the process of backing the losing side. And in so doing, he is throwing away all of the pretense that he brought forward. Actually, it's a 1960s, 1950s Nehru type posture of the non-aligned movement, that we are the model for the global South and for Central America and South America. He's blowing right through that. If he goes too far, I think he puts himself in danger within the Forbidden City. I'm sure the hard men understand the lessons of Khrushchev in 1964 when he suddenly found himself outside looking in. So it is to look at China. Now, what is the national interest? I don't think it's anything more complicated than the Truman Doctrine. Let's go back to that era. Harry Truman, decorated soldier of World War I, knew the horrors of combat. He'd seen it in its most extreme during the Meuse-Argonne. He also knew that the United States could not be everywhere. So he said that we will assist all nations opposing outside aggression and an armed minority from within. This is the nonsense about defending democracy. That works probably in some Yale faculty lounge. That doesn't move populations. But supporting those who are opposing forces who seek the destruction of the United States. If they'd said that from day one, and I agree with Molly very much about the disaster that is this administration, as I mentioned, the faculty lounge pieties that come out of it every day, the incremental approach without telling the American people what we're about. I go back to Bismarck. Bismarck was very clear. He said actually two funny things. One was that he said that the Almighty does three things. He protects fools, drunkards, and the United States of America. But he also said, and this got him dismissed by the vainglorious young Kaiser William, woe be unto the statesmen whose reasons for entering war are not as clear at the end as they were at the beginning. We have not had that. And just to add, to gild the lily, the insanity of this administration's policy is that they're coddling up to the theocratic fanatics in Tehran, hoping for a deal, paying them off. At the same time, the mullahs are supplying weapons to the Russians who are killing the people we are supporting in Ukraine. And I mean, that is the disaster that is this administration. The national interest for the United States is to protect ourselves and by deterring China and all of its agencies, and helping the Ukrainians defeat, and they will defeat, the so-called Russian steamroller. Didn't work in 1916 and 15 in Tannenberg. It only worked in World War II because we supplied them. I think that is where we need to focus. And again, this administration has no concept. Last thing, I'll leave you with a story that has sort of animated my view of what's wrong, not only with their management of the military, but with their foreign policy outlook. And I think Molly actually, if you didn't write about it, you talked about it on television. Our friend Mr. Blinken, and if you haven't read the Saint's biography of Mr. Blinken, check the post out from 2 days ago. He's the greatest statesman since Thomas Jefferson, according to the Washington Post.
Well, Blinken does rhyme with Lincoln.
That's right. Lincoln, Blinken, and not Lincoln. Alaska, March 2021.
Yes.
He's sitting across from the foreign minister of China, who reads back to our Secretary of State the woke condemnations of our society uttered not by members of the Politburo or even the Yale or Harvard faculty, but by Joseph Robinette Biden. And the only thing our Secretary of State could do was say, we have to improve. Now, had that been Molly, Jim, Keith, Keith, Linda, Donald Trump, Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, the response would have been, the United States is the greatest force for good in the history of this planet. We are not going to be lectured by a regime that has murdered 100 million of its own people since 1949. But if you can't defend the nation rhetorically, it's going to be a hell of a lot tougher to defend the nation kinetically. And that's the fear that I have in the next 2 years of this administration. It's a long-winded answer.
Molly, what do you think our American interest is in Ukraine?
Oh, dear.
Oh,
So
boy.
I really loved so much of what was just said. I also agree that China is our big adversary and that we should be laser focused on how to handle that country. And I view national interest as more like a sliding scale. It's not like there's no interest in defeating Russia and Ukraine, but I do think we need to prioritize and think through how we're going to be successful over the long run.
Right.
And, you know, thinking back to like 1970s, how we handled our fighting of the Cold War, understanding that we didn't want China and the Soviet Union in alliance because it's just so difficult to take them both on at once. This was a lot about what we saw during the Trump presidency, was about understanding that China was our primary adversary and that we needed to focus there while still keeping those two countries apart. And just in general, I wish that people on the right kind of understood that we won the Cold War and that we defeated the Soviet Union, and that the country that dominates global communism today is Red China, not Russia. And so we do need to engage in something of a Cold War against them. And when you look at what we did to successfully win the Cold War against the Soviets, that was like an all hands on deck kind of situation. Yes, a lot of that was about our military posture and having strength there, but also about not engaging with them so much economically, about having Hollywood and the media understanding that they were an adversary, as opposed to how we have it now, where they're like the heroes of all our movies are the Chinese, you know, and where all of our politicians are in bed with the Chinese. It's very hard to wage a Cold War when we are so embedded with that country. So I am mostly thinking about Ukraine. Does this help us fight our actual adversary, China, or engage with them or keep them at bay? We see how even some of the economic sanctions that we put in place against Russia do not seem to have had the kind of effect that we were hoping for. This is in large part because we don't have a global alliance together against Russia. You do see that there are many countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, China that are more than happy to do trade with them. Their GDP is slated to grow quite a bit this year. Ours is going to be very low. And so we have to think about whether it's in our interest right now to have that kind of economic disparity against Russia while we're actually trying to take on China, and whether it's in our interest to have China and Russia have this easy alliance, whether we're risking losing out as the global, you know, as having like the global reserve currency. There are all these bigger issues in play that make me worried about our weakness in the short to long term, that I do not hear anybody who's involved in the supposed strategy of winning this war in Ukraine even thinking about or talking about or addressing. So there is interest. You know, there's always interest when a country is unjustly invaded, but whether it outweighs all the other interests. And then the other thing I just want to mention too is that we are very weak right now. Like you talked about what Blinken should have said. That was a humiliating moment for our country. But it's also true that we were able to fight the Cold War in part because we were upholding some principles that we do not seem to uphold right now. And it makes for really easy rhetorical attack by our adversaries, that we aren't strong as a nation, that we don't teach and inculcate in our children a love of country and patriotism, that our morals are all out of whack, and particularly in how we are dealing with children, the types of ideologies we're pushing on them. These are also national security issues, and they're reflected in how difficult it is to recruit for the military right now. Like just the fact that I don't trust many generals in our military to wage any conflict at all right now. I mean, like our military, but I don't like a lot of the leadership, and the political leadership is even worse. So, sorry, that's all over the place. But there's interest, but there are much other more important interests that I'm worried are going by the wayside.
Yeah, Molly, you should have been at the lunch meeting. They said, let's get rid of all the 3 and 4 stars, start all over again.
Oh, amen. I'm joining that.
You have to go.
Good way to start.
Yeah. Well, look, I love this, right? First of all, we don't agree on everything. And to me, this is absolutely the strength of the conservative movement and our massive competitive advantage, because how you actually get a good foreign and national security policy is people that don't agree on things, but share the common interest of doing what's best for the American people and putting that first. That's how you get a good policy. So I'd much, first of all, I'm fanboy on both these guys. So, and I love Molly's term about a sliding interest, because it's really the kind of the architecture that we've really lost since the end of the Cold War, of being serious about national security and foreign policy, thinking we could just kind of do whatever we want. It didn't matter how big our debt was and everything else, right? So there are what's called vital interests, which are the things that literally would put the security and future and the integrity of your state at risk. And these are things that you would fight and die for. And a governor who I shall not mention inartfully said, well, it's not really a vital interest, because it's not. Actually, nobody argues it's a vital interest. I mean, just thinking about it from this perspective, Ukraine and the Black Sea were controlled by Russia through the entire Cold War for decades. And we're still here. So obviously, it's not something that's putting it's existential to our future, right? So I think we can put that off the table. I don't think anybody really argues that. It's a reason why we're not a party to the conflict. It's a reason why I think we will never be a party to the conflict. So then there are, at the other end, there are things that are called peripheral interests, which is if you're, anybody here, where are you from? Sorry, where's your family from? Before that, anywhere like Minnesota. Anybody here, family from a country? Yeah. No, you don't count. Give me yeah, where are you from? They're perfect, right? We love Jamaica, right? And that's what we would call a peripheral interest, which is definitely humiliating if you're a Jamaican, right? But I mean, we like Jamaica. We like them to do things. We'd like them to do less with the Chinese. I get all that. But it's a very modest level of commitment that you're willing to make. And then there are things that fall in the middle, which are important. They're important enough to do something, but they're not important enough to go to war, and they're not important enough to do nothing. And I think that's where Ukraine falls. It's why it's complicated. And I think it's why this is exactly the debate we should be having, because it's not really a question of should we do nothing and turn our back on the Ukrainians, or should we start World War III? It's what is reasonable and credible and worth doing and efficacious. And I think that's why this debate really should have been had among conservatives 2 years ago. And if there's any criticism I would make of the people who I love, which are all conservatives, it's before this war started. Why did we not sit down and have a debate among ourselves about what's the practical and realistic thing to do, rather than wait for the war to start and then we all start saying whatever? And we've never really, as a community, sat down and had the discussion that we're just having now. So here's the one thing I will say. So what's important? And maybe where I would differ with Molly a little bit, because if Putin's interest was just on reabsorbing Ukraine and then he'd be done, I think that would be fine. But I think it's very clear from the intelligence, from his own writings, from the politics of Russia, that their goals are quite more expansive. It is to reabsorb the post-Soviet states. It's to have dictatorial control over Central Europe. It's really to see NATO dissolve, to see the United States leave. And I think disconnecting the U.S. from the larger Atlantic security does actually impinge on our interests, and therefore that's really unacceptable to us. And so I do fall into the argument that if they're stopped in Ukraine, that we are actually not just buying a lot in our own future and security, but our own future and security are actually going to be a lot cheaper to afford. And then that goes right with that is the biggest cheerleaders for that are China. That's because China wants exactly what Russia wants. It wants a Europe that's disorganized and distracted and divided. And so stopping Russia also thwarts, in a sense, Chinese interests. So here's the one small thing where I would disagree with General Kellogg, which is why I love this thing, because if I did it in uniform, he would smack me around, but he can't do it now. We all agree on this, that China is the existential threat, and we need to pivot in the sense that we need to have a profoundly strong conventional and strategic deterrent against the Chinese to prevent even really bigger and much more serious problems. I don't think there's any dispute on the panel. I don't necessarily argue that Ukraine is distracting us from that. First of all, the kinds of munitions that we're using in Ukraine, the kinds of assets that we're sending are not the kind of things that would be pivotal in deterring the Chinese. We need a much more powerful Navy. We need a much more robust strategic military. And that's what's going to scare the hell out of the Chinese. And Ukraine's not keeping us from doing that. Joe Biden's keeping us from doing that. And honestly, people talk about the cost, $6 trillion in deficit spending. If Joe Biden would just give me the money that they wasted on COVID fraud, I could buy the space and naval capabilities that we need to deter China. So I cherish the dialogue we have, and I'm such a fan of the American Foreign Policy Institute for organizing this, because by God, we could figure this out. And the problem, I think the problem has really been defined by this panel, who all said the same thing. This country is run by a Yahoo. And that's our biggest problem with having a good Ukraine policy.
Yeah. General, let me add to that. I got to come up with something in Latin that was Yahoo. The Jesuits would like.
Yahoo is Latin.
But let's talk about that for a second with Biden and Putin in this man's head. And Linda and I are from the same part of the country, and I'm going to use a General Grant example, which my ancestors will roll over in their grave. So Grant arrives at the Wilderness, and the Army of the Potomac has just been beaten up and down by the Army of Northern Virginia. And he gets into his tent, and all the generals who've been in there before he came are saying, Bobby Lee's going to do this, and Bobby Lee's going to do that. And Grant looks at him and he says, would you stop worrying about what he's going to do to you and start worrying about what you're going to do to him? Bring up some guns. The reason I say that Putin is in the head of these people is that, and just to juxtapose it, I mean, let's talk about what genius Putin is. He claims to want to be an heir to Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Alexander the First. He's done something unthinkable. He's brought Sweden and Finland out of the cold. Finland's artillery now ranges St. Petersburg. His entire northern flank in the Arctic is now open to two militaries that are a heck of a lot more capable than the Russian military. He sacrificed hundreds of thousands of his troops in not a World War II battle, something that horrified the world in World War I, just over the top, human wave after human wave. And he's bankrupted his country, yet this administration is always worried not about claiming the ground and directing events. It's worried about what Putin is going to do next. And I would argue he's not Bismarck, he's not even Jimmy Carter. And that is the great danger, because there are people in Beijing who are a hell of a lot smarter and have a hell of a lot deeper worldview than anybody in the Kremlin does.
Can I push back a little bit on that? One of the things I worry about is, okay, let's say everything you said about Putin is 100% accurate. One thing I think that people neglect is they think everything that's happening with the invasion of Ukraine is Putin directed, when there are in fact quite a few people in Russia. There's like broad support for what they're doing. And you sometimes hear neocons say that just learning all the lessons they learned from previous regime change failures, that they would like to do a regime change in Russia as if that's going to go any better than all of the previous times. And they don't understand that the Russians are largely behind what Putin is doing, even if they're not happy with how the war is being executed. But the other thing is, even stupid people can draw, or even stupid strategy can draw people into a global conflict. And you look at all of the stupidity that led to World War I. It was a lot of people making decisions that they thought sounded good in the short term, but ended up in just one of the most horrific wars that Earth has ever seen. And this is why it would be great if statesmen were being involved right now to help avoid that kind of sleepwalking into a global conflict or stumbling into it or exacerbation of the war. And we're thinking about how we could get to a place where we could have the best possible resolution with the least amount of carnage, because there are areas that can be dealt with. I mean, even if you think Russia's doing horribly, and I always think it's a little overstated given that they're still slogging along here, and they still have some wins that they take every once in a while. There's a lot of room here for wise leaders to bring everybody to the table and have some kind of resolution where Ukraine does not have to deal with Russian aggression, where Russia can get have some security about some of what they've taken, and that the U.S. can have its dominance and its control here. I'm worried about Xi coming in and being the statesman that resolves things. That's not a situation we want to find ourselves in, but we aren't really providing leadership. We keep on kind of deferring to Ukraine and just giving them stuff. That's not really a strategy. Throwing money and expensive weapons at a country isn't a strategy, and I haven't really heard anyone articulate a strategy, much less one that's in our interest.
Can I?
No, it's, Molly just made a comment, we talked about $153 billion spent in the last year on Ukraine through 4 supplementals. That's larger than the DHS budget for this year. Think about that. And when you look at what's happened, wars are generally started by miscalculations. You make a mistake, you overcompensate. And one of the comments that President Zelensky made, that he said that the war started in Ukraine, the war started in 2014, and he means Crimea, and it will end in Crimea. It's a pretty large statement to make, and when you see what Putin's goals is as well. So what I'd like to ask the entire panel, because we haven't seen one, what is the end state? What is a pragmatic, realistic end state that can bring this war to a conclusion, and how would you do it? James?
Yeah, so it's the wrong question. Thank you. Because I believe in America first, and the question for us is not when does the war end, but how do we protect our interests? And our interest is to not see the Russians win. So we'd all like peace, but then the question is what leverage does the United States have to drive peace? And the only leverage that we have on the Russians is punitive. Right? So sending arms for Ukrainians to defend themselves, that puts pressure on the Russians. Robert briefly, Mr. Secretary briefly mentioned this ridiculously ludicrous situation we're in, where yesterday Ted Cruz took apart Blinken and he says, look, you're funding both sides of the war. You're sending over $100 billion to Ukrainians to fight Russians, and then you're allowing the Iranians, because you still want a deal with them, to essentially funnel money and technology and stuff and a lifeline to the Russians. You're paying both sides of the war here. This is nonsense. So there's a lot we could do in terms of cracking down on additional assets and capability that can go to Russia. But what's the leverage that we have on the Ukrainians? Well, the only leverage we have over the Ukrainians is supporting their military. And if we stop supporting the military, the only person that benefits that is the Russians. So I just think from a realist perspective, because the one thing I love about being a conservative is that we believe in realism, is we don't have leverage to drive the two sides to stop fighting. We do have leverage to protect our interests, and again, we could debate how much money, how we could stop Biden from essentially being an irresponsible leader in so many different aspects of the war, including so abusing Republican support for the war to use every single fund that's gone to Ukraine as an excuse to spend billions and trillions of dollars on other stuff and just write blank checks for other things. We could, and I think that's essentially in the practical thing where we're going to be arguing. The end state is, for us, I think, is how we prevent Putin from moving beyond Ukraine. And we can do that by helping Ukraine defend itself, but we could be so much better at this.
Right. So I wrote a piece a few months ago that America should rest easy because the professionals are in charge at the White House. Trump was the amateur, never studied strategy, but Blinken and Sullivan, the author of the Steele dossier, are running things. So here's where we don't have any thought in depth. I saw the figures today about NATO spending. There are 6 of the 20-something NATO nations that are living up to their commitments. Poland, all of the states that were under the boot of the Soviet Union, plus the United Kingdom, although I would argue that a lot of that in the United Kingdom is superfluous. They have the smallest fleet since the reign of Charles II in 1653. There are more active duty soldiers at Fort Bragg, and I will continue to call it Fort Bragg, than there are in the British Army. It is incumbent, or beyond this administration, to do something that Molly talked about in the past, and that is to begin to turn over many of these problems to the Europeans and say, go to it, children. Your GDP is 1.2 times the size of ours. The Russian GDP is somewhere around Paraguay's in terms of size. And that is the way we begin to forcefully deal with China, in addition to changing the trajectory of our defense budget. The defense budget today is the lowest since the second year after World War II, when we demobilized 15 million Americans and thought that the atomic bomb had solved all of our problems. Even under, God bless him, Mr. Carter, defense spending as a proportion of GDP never dipped below 4.5%. We are now headed to about 2.8% under this administration. We have the smallest Navy since 1937, when we had a smaller Navy than Chile. We have the oldest Air Force. And just to use two more anecdotal stories, the Secretary of the Army was recently at Fort Bragg, and instead of telling the world about the preparedness of the All-American Division or Army Special Operations Command, she tweeted out several times that Fort Bragg was leading the world in fighting climate change. The Secretary of the Navy just had a press conference with the Prime Minister of the Bahamas, said that his top priority is climate change. There was a Twitter response to the Secretary of the Army, and I don't usually quote Twitter, but the response right underneath her last statement about climate change is that these are not serious people. And that's what we have to muddle our way through in the next 2 years. We've been there before. Unfortunately, Joe Biden is not Jimmy Carter. He's not smart enough to do what Carter did and pivot and say, I was wrong. And by the way, Soviet Union, here comes the Minuteman III, the Abrams tank, and the B-1 bomber. You can't compete with us. Now, it didn't save his presidency, but it gave Mr. Reagan a great start in his campaign to destroy the evil empire.
Joe, could I just add one quick footnote before we go to Molly? Because the question was, what can we do? Where should we be going, right? And one of the things I can think and specifically to Molly's point, is we can look at a much flatter force structure in Western Europe. I mean, I think we can get by, because we denuded Russian conventional, well, not we, the Ukrainians have denuded Russian military capability to the point where I just think the bar is far lower than it was, than we looked at 10 years ago. I think something like the equivalent of 2 U.S. forward deployed brigades in Central Europe is probably all we really need. That's we've been consistently reducing conventional force structure in Western Europe for 30 years. And I think 2 brigades would, for where we are, actually would be fine. About 5 wings would be fine, but the naval presence we have now is about fine. That's a significantly lower footprint than a lot of people argued for 4 or 5 years ago. And that has to be coupled with, and it's something I think that we can really push for. And I think this war has shown a lot of allies. And so, for example, look at the Italians, who have really turned on a dime and are looking to increase their defense spending up to 3% of GDP. I don't really care if Iceland gets to 2% of GDP, but the countries that strategically are really relevant, like Germany, the policy has to be go back to hammering them to get to the 2% GDP, to continue on the initiatives they have now in rebuilding their defense industrial base and ammunition, to build back the conventional force structure that they should largely provide for the forward defense of Europe up to 300,000. And that really does open up a lot of space to the United States to do the kinds of things we need to do in the Pacific that Molly's calling for.
Just give you a quick example. Finland, in 24 hours, can put 280,000 soldiers in the field. In Finland, everyone serves from the age of 16 to the age of 60. They have more artillery than any country in NATO, including us. The same with the Swedes in terms of the sophistication of their armed forces. This allows us to reposition and to go where Teddy Roosevelt pointed us. The future's in the Pacific. He said that in 1903. I agree with James that we have to put more of the onus on the Europeans.
Yeah. Well, before I turn to you quickly, for that same answer, I remember when we were in the White House right before the last election and took to the Vice President, I said, you know, Mr. Vice President, we're going to have to talk about reducing the size of the DOD budget and relook at it. And his response to me was, Kellogg, go stand in the corner and keep your mouth shut. So, not a good, but it's a good point. Molly, what do you think?
I want to point out that what was just articulated is also extremely politically popular. So you saw when Russia unjustly invaded Ukraine a year ago, there was just widespread polling support for U.S. involvement, which has precipitously dropped since then, and particularly among Republican voters. But you ask a question about whether the United States should be funding this effort more than Europe is, and that's like a mom's and apple pie kind of response. Like, nobody thinks we should be funding this more than Europe is. And, you know, we hear about maybe Putin has these aims of expanding even beyond Ukraine, going into other countries. Well, if there really is that threat and Europe isn't taking it seriously enough to arm up and to prepare for it, then that should affect our calculations as well. If it's not something Europe cares about, we can't care for them. I also wanted to say something about, you said you were wrong about something, and I've been wrong about so much.
No, I've never been wrong about anything.
Okay, but I mean, I've been wrong since the beginning. Like, I didn't think Russia.
Well,
was
yeah,
gonna,
I didn't think you'd do a winter offensive. I mean,
that.
It wasn't the smart move, but that didn't deter him, obviously.
Right, I didn't think they would make that move for Kyiv at all. And when that happened, like on day one, I was like, okay, well, apparently I don't have a good read on this situation. And even the restraint that, like, it is true that Putin has not indicated that he's threatened, but hasn't indicated that he would use nukes. But I just think we should always remember at all times that when you have that type of nuclear capability, you don't have to accept conventional defeat. And that's why we should be thinking about it as we work to have some kind of settlement, some kind of agreement. There is plenty of room to work here. And we should have probably done it right when the Ukrainians, who I think shocked everybody by how well they fought early on. That was such a position of strength, like right there, it might have been a good time to go for an agreement. Before any conflict happened, would have been a good time to go for some kind of agreement, to let Ukraine have a situation where it won't be bullied by Russia, where it won't be controlled by Russia, but also understanding that Russia has some pretty serious concerns about NATO expansion. And, you know, there's plenty of room to work even with bad guys. And, you know, that's something Reagan was very good at, you know, throughout his presidency. There's no reason why we can't, except for our current political leadership doesn't seem capable.
Yeah, we have time for one more question before I get there, because there's three of us, we've all been at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. It'll always be Fort Bragg to me, okay, even though they changed it to Fort Liberty. But, you know, we always talk about soldiers and how soldiers are, you know, really think about it. They have no idea who Braxton Bragg was, but the funniest question is always when the long street at Fort Bragg goes from the garrison all the way out to Sicily drop zone. And I would ask soldiers, who's Longstreet named after? It's not named after anybody, sir. It's the longest street at Fort Bragg. No, it's named after James J. Longstreet, a Confederate general, but they didn't know it. So I said, when we rename installations, it's kind of crazy. Okay, the last question, I think we've had some congressional members today, both senators and representatives, talk. My question is, okay, we've talked about Ukraine. We've talked about the president not having an end state or declared end state, but yet they hold the pocket of the purse. They've passed 4 supplementals. They're talking about a 5th supplemental this summer. Starting with you, James, and working down from James to Robert to Molly, what is the role of Congress and what should they be doing?
Yeah, I am on record on this. I am in the no blank check camp. This is it's nonsense to tie Ukraine funding to all other kinds of idiotic stuff. And no member of Congress should vote for that, period, ever. It's just wrong. And I think the president does have the administration has serious questions to answer on accountability and on what's your plan. And I think absent those 3 things, I don't support this government wasting money. And the notion is, well, what about the people of Ukraine? It says we don't serve the people of Ukraine by ill-serving the American people. We are ill-serving the American people by not having accountability, not telling them what the plan is, and by not being physically responsible in how we fund military aid. So I'm sorry, I just think those three things are non-negotiable, and any member of Congress that votes another way, 501c3, so what can I say? But I don't think right. I just want to say one thing just really super quick, because the one thing we have been, we want allies to step up and do more, and I don't think a lot of people realize this, and I spent a lot of time in Western Europe, including being in Ukraine, and we have seen a real interesting development in the last couple of years in Europe. The rise of the center-right governments, which have proven incredibly resilient despite inflation, despite energy prices, despite the war, despite being called fascist and racist by Brussels. Very popular, very resilient, incredibly pro-American, incredibly anti-Russian, incredibly anti-China, incredibly pro-Ukraine, all of which who give, in many cases, well beyond their means in terms of GDP to improve their own militaries. There is a band of brothers that is growing up through North and Central and Southern Europe who are more, I have much more in common with than anybody in California. And all they really want from the United States is, don't turn our back on us. We have to carry our load. We have to carry our share. It's our responsibility to defend our countries. We get that. All we want from you is to be a brother with us, and then we will be a brother with you. We're getting exactly what Donald Trump asked for and demanded, and rightfully so. And I think we have to recognize that too, even as we look at the slackers and the freeloaders.
Yeah, I can't make any better statement and conclusion than that. And I would remind you that the president of Poland said that the newest military installation in his country is Camp Trump. And again, for all the talk about from Foreign Affairs and Harvard and Yale and Princeton about the amateurs in the Trump administration and the professionals saving us, it was that focus on the Europeans doing more and the focus on those countries in Europe that had directly felt the jackboot of the Soviet Union that has led to the revitalization that began a few years ago that James is talking about, and I think we should do everything we can to encourage it. And that also means changing the trajectory of the way we do business, both in terms of diplomacy and soft power. I said earlier today, can you tell me where the three largest embassies on the planet, on the U.S. embassies on the planet are? They're in Berlin, Paris, and London, which is a very 19th century look at the planet. American power needs to be spread across the globe in those places that immediately impact the national security of this country, which means that we need to pay more attention to Asia. I'll just give you one example of Trump administration's worldview. I'm the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. I took trips to Micronesia, Palau, the Marshall Islands, when we anticipated a visit from a senior Chinese official. I was a cabinet rank, an officer of state, to go there and say the Trump administration is here. We support you against encroachments by the Communist Party of China. I can't imagine Joe Biden or Sullivan being able to point to the map of the Pacific and find Micronesia or Palau or the Marshall Islands. That's how sophisticated we got. And that's the kind of clear-headed thinking we need to have once again.
Molly?
So I realize I'm speaking in Washington, D.C., but I would encourage Congress to understand the difference between what the swamp thinks and what the American people think. The foreign policy articulated by President Trump forced a return by the Republican Party to an era of strong foreign policy. There was a detour that Republicans took that was politically disastrous, that was not Republican foreign policy. It's more like Wilsonian progressivism. This brief interlude that they took to do democracy spreading and nation building. It is not Republican, it is not conservative, and it should really have nothing to do with the Republican Party. And getting the party and just getting Americans back to a foreign policy laser focused on national interest, supporting a very strong national defense, interested in what's going on throughout the world. This is a gift, and it's something that members of Congress should heed, and they should remember, again, how politically toxic that deviation was, including that it helped lead to like 60 Democrats in the Senate passing Obamacare, because people were so sick of the way that we were mismanaging our war effort, not having good strategy, and
Or turning Kabul, 8th century Kabul into 20th century Paris.
and so just politically speaking, it's wise to remember that, and it's not, you don't turn away from this nation building disaster by retreating away from the world, but you just have that very strong, consistent foreign policy that we saw from Eisenhower to Nixon to Reagan, and then we kind of fell away from in the early part of this millennium.
Amen.
Yes. So that's that's not directly addressing how to handle funding or whatnot, but just keep that in mind, that the pressure of DC is not what the American people want or will reward you for.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. And when you look at the comment that we didn't have adults in the room, look at the people up here. We had adults in the room in the last administration, and I think we knew what we were talking about. And with that, that's the end of this. And what I'd like to do is you all hold in place because we have some closing remarks from Chad as well. And I want to thank the panel. Thanks very much for being here. Really appreciate it. It's an important topic.
Thank you.
So, what we want to you all. Is it live now or no? We're seeing. We live? Okay. I want to thank you all for being here today at the America First Policy Institute. I just heard today the first annual National Security Symposium. That means there's going to be more, I guess. I think that was a question to so much for this one for Linda and Brooke. I also want to thank the panelists that we had today. I think they were really great. All of them were. It was pretty interesting. We were able to get people from Congress as well, which was always good. And we had a great number of people on those panels. I think we started with Steve Yates, which was an incredible discussion, I thought, on the threat from China and the Chinese Communist Party. Then we had Chad Wolf on a great exchange on Homeland Security at risk as well. We had Fred discussed at the lunch panel, which was a lot of fun, about with Congressman Ronnie Jackson and Robert Wilkie as well, about the elements of the American First approach to national security. We had Jacob Alladort. I think Jacob is in the room. Where's Jacob? We'll lead the panel on the Middle East with Senator Langford, Congressman Tenney, Rob Greenway, and Victoria Coates. And then finally, we had the panel just a minute ago when we talked about, I think, the largest security issue we have facing internationally in the United States today, and that's Ukraine. Today's conversations not only reaffirmed what I believe are the guiding principles that you've heard on the America First Doctrine, but also hopefully some pragmatic ways to bolster each one of our national security areas to restore a strong America. And the America First approach affirms that America's actions in the world must be guided by a single fundamental question. How does this engagement protect and advance the interests of the American people? And that question should frame every one of our engagements in the world, including how we work with allies in transactional relationships and how we engage in multinational efforts. This America First approach to national security is built on the fundamental belief that the world is comprised of sovereign nation states rather than a collectivist community working towards globalist aims, and fundamentally, it is the duty of every nation to secure and advance the interests of their people on the world stage first, which is a worldview not understood by many. I would like to thank you again for attending these discussions of critical national security, the challenges we face today in our nation, and why we must return to an America First approach to address these issues and other threats to our security and freedom as well. And I know Chad's out there somewhere, and I'll ask Chad to, there he is. I know he's right here. Chad, come on. Thanks, Chad.
right. Well, I'm going to close this out. Great panel, great day. There's no doubt that we're living through a dangerous time, one of weakness and heightened threats. And that because, to borrow a line from Winston Churchill, this administration tempts our adversary to trials of strength. This is the same team that brought you Putin's invasion of Crimea in 2014, the famous Red Line in Syria, today has left Americans behind in Afghanistan, allowed Putin to invade a neighboring country, and allows communist China to send unidentified objects over the United States, and has substituted border security with a neat and colorful phrase, hemispheric migration management, whatever that means. Thankfully, we have an all-star team here at AFPI, as well as our partners and friends who you heard from today, who are not theoreticians. They are actually practitioners of the America First movement. They know America First foreign policy because they are the ones who served tirelessly in the last administration to implement or advise us on it. And today we've had the privilege of being reminded what that America First policy vision is. Learn from those architects of that peace through strength, whether it's the historic Abraham Accords agreement in the Middle East, or those that made our military strong and lethal, and those that have made our borders secure and our families safe. My friends, thank you again for all being here today, standing together, for fighting alongside us in this fight. Today's conversation was the first of its kind, but it is also an invitation to continue. We invite you to follow our work and to stay engaged. So with that, thank you again, and God bless.